And now it's a great pleasure to ask to come to the stage Humberto Delgado Rosa, as you know, Director of Natural Capital in the DG Environment in the European Commission. Humberto previously worked as Director in DG Climate Action, so he knows a lot about what we were speaking of yesterday. And he was also Secretary of State for Environment in Portugal, and will talk to us about the European perspective. Humberto, thank you very much for coming.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, Excellency, organizers, the Irish colleagues that have put forward this conference on new horizons for nature. And nature indeed needs quite some new horizons, as you may have captured from Inger's intervention. My message, what I want to share with you, is first, I will not resist to give you a bit of my own perception of the global context, so as to put the EU status, the status of European nature within it. I will refer also to the EU policy framework, to what is the EU post-2020 vision for nature and biodiversity. I'll refer to some funding and other mechanisms that do exist nowadays for conservation, and within that, to the role that Ireland, in my view, has and may have in this context. But to put it very simply, I don't need to spend much words on the global context after Inger, but I think we can say in a nutshell, why does nature need a new path? Well, because the history of human expansion so far has been a history of atmosphere degradation, we call it climate change, and more than that, also pollution, ocean degradation, look to acidification, plastification, overexploitation, overfishing, and so forth, and land degradation. That's quite widespread. So in a nutshell, we develop, and at the same time, we shrink the biosphere. We degrade the biosphere. And there's an intuitive level when everyone, the man and the woman in the street, understands we can't really be sustainable if we are doing that, can we? But there's also something that comes from the facts, which is, we now know there are no three pillars of sustainable development, There are three layers of sustainable development. Now, it's not a three-legged chair model. It's a wedding cake or a pyramid model. We still need the three layers, but they have a hierarchy. There's only one, which is the underlying layer that sustains the others, which is the environment or biosphere or nature, upon which you can build a society, upon which you can build an economy. And actually, it's this underlying layer of the biosphere that sustains life on Earth. It's life, and it's the life supporting system. So we cannot pass without it, and it's pretty much recognized nowadays. Yeah, yes, we have a climate crisis, but we also have an ecological crisis that goes beyond just the climate. And one could say, likely in the second layer, there's an inequality crisis brewing, but I won't spend time on that one now. But now, don't think these two crises I've referred, climate and ecology, are that different. They're actually two faces of the same coin. And I can just share with you something that struck me recently. There's this Drawdown project. You can Google it, Drawdown, where they identify, evaluate, quantify, and rank the best solutions for climate change mitigation. I've looked into the top 20. Would you expect maybe a majority of fossil fuel or energy-related measures? Well, you'll find 5, not top-ranked. And you'll find 12, which are land-use related, nature-related, food-related, and the like. So it's two sides of the same coin. But getting back now to this sixth great extinction that's ongoing, well, science has noted for long. We have had all the alerts from the scientific world that this was happening. But I would say very significantly, young people have noticed. You may have noticed the fact that this young Swedish girl that has done an individual strike for climate change, and that example is kind of spreading in Europe. I happened to work in Brussels, and I was surprised that Thursday morning I was having a meeting. We could not pass because there were students demonstrating in favor of climate. Their panels don't refer only to climate, save our nature, I've also seen. And every week they do it, and it grows, and it's now expanding to other countries. So I think that's pretty remarkable. Business has noticed. The World Economic Forum that meets in Davos every year Well, I've taken a look to their global risk assessment that they do yearly. If you go back to 2015, you already find their climate. Nowadays, you find in the top 3 risks, climate and nature. So world business has noticed this is a problem. And we in the European Commission, yes, we have noticed that biodiversity conservation is critical to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I invite you to take a look to the recent reflection paper called Towards a Sustainable Europe by 2030, where you'll find very clear recognition of the climate crisis, of course, but also of the ecological crisis that we'll need to tackle for. So this paper calls for a transition to sustainable and fair economy in a way that leaves no one and no place behind, and that tackles the economic, the ecological, and the climate crisis. And indeed, I think EU citizens in general are noticing, and I'll refer a bit later, what's driving this conscience. But now let me go to status of EU's biodiversity. Well, we live in an area of the world which is inhabited for long and quite densely populated, so it's no surprise that the nature and landscapes we have are usually influenced by humans, but this was a creative influence. We have a mosaic of natural and cultural landscapes that we appreciate and that are high in biodiversity. And I'll share a personal story with you. When I was a teenager, I was already quite motivated for nature. I think I was born like that. And I remember that my preferred beach was a beach that my father had known with no access other than a trail. And I've known it with a road, hotel, motel, swimming pool, rooms, all that. And when I was a teenager, I remember thinking for myself, well, this has reached a limit. From now on, and this was in the 70s, from now on, things will suddenly get better. I was very naive. Actually, some of my preferred spots of biodiversity and nature are literally beneath a dam or a road in my own country. And actually what was happening, well, this great acceleration was just happening and getting to speed in the 70s. It had delivered a lot of positives. There are many indicators of human development that are now better. But for the natural resources, for the natural world, all the indicators have gone hockey stick worse. And that's the situation we have also in Europe. In these past 50 years, there's a major negative impact on our own nature. And sometimes people, well, biodiversity is an issue of coral reefs and tropical forests somewhere. No, 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 it's in Europe. We now have something to show it, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the parallel to the IPCC for climate. It has done its regional report for Europe and Asia, and we have big problems in Europe. Just in a nutshell, 14 out of 15 terrestrial habitat types have declined since the 50s. Wetlands extent declined 50% since 1970, when I was thinking we have reached the plateau. Only 9% of marine habitat types are in favorable conservation status. In the past decade, 26% of marine fish populations declined, 42% of terrestrial animal and plant species, 71% of freshwater fish, 60% of amphibians. And we have lost, between 1960 and 2016, some 50% of a special kind of ecosystem services, which are the regulating services. So we have been using the material services, food, fiber, etc., at the expense of the regulating examples. And in Europe as elsewhere, we do have a problem on another point of view that could be called the baseline. You referred to corncrakes and curlews, and my Irish colleagues tell me that quite some years, not too that long ago in rural Ireland, that would have been a normal, a familiar voice of the curlew and of the corncrake. But I'm told that probably those beneath 30 years nowadays living in Ireland haven't really detected that we are losing some of our identity and some of these sources of inspiration a bit everywhere. Examples also exist in other countries. Now, a fundamental issue is, well, some of us happen to believe, that's my case, that nature has a value in itself. Independent of what we do with it, it's valuable, we should preserve it. Those that are pre-convinced of this, we are fine, huh? We are on the same club. Many in our society aren't. But the good news is we don't need to convince others of any kind of special, intrinsic, non-anthropocentric value, because nature has huge instrumental value, has huge anthropocentric value, and Inger has put that into evidence, namely also through the amount of ecosystem services, pollination, freshwater quantity and quantity, soil formation, flood management. In a nutshell, nature has a huge economic positive impact, part of which is monetizable, part of which is not, but it's still very huge, and this allows us to defend it, to show that natural capital is valuable, adding to other values that nature does have. Now, one thing that we know as doomsaying is not enough to change people's mind. We have seen all the discourse, the sixth race extinction, or the WWF report has shown that in the last couple of decades, we've lost some 60% of vertebrate populations. But you know, a human being listens to this, what can I do? I go on with my living, so I'll just grab my next beer and I go on. Now, what really moves people is when you see a link between what's happening and some things you do or can have an impact for you. And my perception that I share with you, I think at least in Europe, the single issue that is now more and more driving attention is bugs, insects. Not because people love bugs, but people don't like this idea of a widespread pollution out there changing nature. And people cherish, many people cherish some naturalness in their food. So if you link what to produce my food, we lose that nature, farmland nature, and at the same time I get residues in my food, the health of my babies. This is what I think has a great potential to raise attention within the EU for the causes of decline, which are largely land use change and the intensification of production, together with the old culprits of resource extraction, pollution, invasive species, climate change also, yes, but the main issue is still land use change to living nature. This was the situation in Europe, but then you can tell me, what about the EU policy framework? Don't we have some lovely regulations and strategies to deal with the problem? Yes, we do. We do have a EU biodiversity strategy. We have strong nature directives, the birds and habitats directives. Many ambitious targets, many associated actions, many initiatives in it, but then how can this be explained? Well, there's something that orients on this. We have done a thorough evaluation of the nature directives back then in 2016. And the conclusion, in a nutshell, they remain highly valuable and important, but they do face an important implementation gap. There's you find in this evaluation a lot of success stories, a lot of demonstration. We can restore nature, we can bring back species. On birds, through the LIFE program, we have excellent examples. It's just not enough. The rhythm of loss outpaces, offsets all that is being done. So more needs to be done. And in a nutshell, I could tell you, of course, we can and do more on conservation policy. We have launched a nature action plan following the evaluation of directives. We call it the Action Plan for Nature, People and the Economy. It has around 114 sub-actions. I won't pass them in review, but you'll find there completing the Natura 2000 network in the marine environment, bringing in the effective management of Natura 2000 that's often lacking, developing also green infrastructure with Natura 2000 in its core, but to address ecological connectivity. And we are bringing in some guidance that will come very soon, for instance, on how to integrate ecosystem services into decision-making at all levels, on how to address EU-level green infrastructure. But the main point that also the biodiversity strategy, the midterm review we've done in 2015, and the one we are starting right now towards 2020, I could give you this summary. Biodiversity policy per se does not have the tools to solve the biodiversity equation. You need to integrate biodiversity policy into the other policies, especially those that are the drivers. And although this has started, we have many progress in the common fishery policy, for instance, is now pretty much ecosystem-based, much more than previously. We have regulation on invasive alien species. We have a EU timber regulation. We have an EU initiative on pollinators. the current common agriculture policy has addressed as a greening that could have delivered much more than it did if it was not diluted in the co-decision process. But what we know is this is not enough, so we need new approaches on integration if we are to change course. So now we know that we are not on track to get to our biodiversity targets, EU biodiversity targets by 2020, and especially this target that is also the global target of halting biodiversity loss, we will not get there. So another point is, what about post-2020? What are the ideas of the EU around that? Inger has explained to us what's happening internationally in terms of the Convention of Biological Diversity. We should get in 2020 in China a new deal for nature. So, but we have had a deal for nature in 2010. We should have halted biodiversity loss. We've concluded we wouldn't. We've postponed it to 2020, and likely we will conclude in 2020. There was some progress, but not enough. So what are the main issues in these pre-consultations we are having with member states that probably will enshrine EU thinking? We don't think we need to change the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature as an aspirational goal, but we do need to unpack it and to know what do we need to do until there, and where should we be in 2030. So we likely will need a EU 2030 headline target as much as possible aligned with the Sustainable Development Agenda that also is for 2030, based on scenario analysis to assess where should we be by 2030 if we want to accomplish the 2050 vision. A very fundamental point, Inger also referred to the current biodiversity targets. We know them as IG targets. If you read them, you'll find several which are hardly measurable or quantifiable, verifiable. So certainly something that we need anew for the new deal for nature is some smart targets that maybe not that many, we don't know, we don't need to predefine, but when someone commits, I will do my share or to this amount, we can actually measure, report, verify, and use maybe a ratcheting up mechanism where more ambition is needed. This is a crucial element missing for nature now, and that does exist in the Paris Accord. So we don't need to do exactly what the climate does, but there are some lessons in climate that likely we will need for China. And of course, there's a lot of supporting and enabling conditions that will have to be promoted: communication, awareness, knowledge, education, resources, financing, capacity building. So we in the EU will be pretty much looking into the development in the CBD, in COP15 in China, so as to redress our post-2020 EU strategy to be aligned with that. Meanwhile, what can we do? I hope I'm not taking too long, but to tell you a bit of the current context, and especially what mechanisms, what funding, and where can Ireland contribute for some of these aspects. We will still be, for the next wave of funds, under an integration approach. Some have called, well, this has failed mainstreaming in other policies, so we need a EU Nature Fund. In the Commission, that's not our view. We think we should make a new wave of effort for integration of biodiversity concerns into EU funding and policies. One of which is actually led by an Irishman, Commissioner Philip Hogan, the proposal for the new CAP, it does bring some novelty, if again, it's not diluted in the co-decision process, and I'm not totally reassured about that. But if you look to some elements, like, well, of course, this so-called Pillar 2, rural development, remains largely unchanged. But if you look to Pillar 1, the direct payments, first there are quite some new, what we call enhanced eco-conditionality, bringing in some new elements to protect wetlands, peatlands, sustainable use of pesticides, water framework directive, those measures that farmers should already abide by regulation so to get the funding. But most especially, there's a novelty, which is member states will have to devise what we call eco-schemes. The eco-schemes will be mandatory for member states, but voluntary for farmers under pure EU funds. And so the member states should devise eco-schemes, The examples we give are organic farming, for landscape features, for grasslands, for results-based payments, and the farmers can opt to come in or come out of those schemes. It changes the mindset for the farmer. It's no longer imposing how many meters you need to do of this and that. You know better. But if you deliver for these goals, then you get an extra incentive. And I think this is rather important. Another aspect, I'll center more on the cap for an insight. I've followed national policy on a member state I know better. One could expect administrations to talk to one another when they are dealing with common issues. That doesn't happen everywhere. I'm not sure about Ireland, but we are imposing in our proposal that the environmental authorities must be involved. Well, in what? Well, the environmental goals of the CAP. It's not to overtake the CAP, of course, but we need to align the CAP environmental objectives with the EU's environmental objectives. So as to design some ambitious CAP strategic plans to capture this. Where Ireland can give a good contribution, I will single out one example. We've heard about the Burren already. The Burren, through a LIFE project, has been a pioneer on the results-based schemes for farmers. You don't prescribe to farmers how best they deliver, let's say, for butterflies or for plants or for whatever biodiversity criteria. But you dialogue, scientists, ecologists, farmers, administration, to devise the scheme. The farmer takes his decisions, and this changes totally the psychology of it again. It's just another crop that you make, another service for which you can get a payment. I think this example of and others that Ireland has pushed through can be very influential, and is being very influential in Europe. I would also single out, in Ireland there is an all-Ireland pollinator plan. It came ahead of the EU's pollinator initiative. We need very much Ireland to support us on this goal, for instance, of devising an indicator on pollinators that can orient the CAP and be picked up for the common agriculture policy too. Just two more words on this aspect of what can be done. I would need to refer the following. You know, the Habitats Directive foresees that there should be some EU co-funding for nature protection. And it also foresees that member states devise what we call, well, their plan of investment, the prioritized action frameworks, where the investment needs for nature are identified. They are now being reviewed, and there will be key elements for the mainstreaming of other funds towards nature and biodiversity. And you will find in the LIFE program, the program for environment and climate, a special kind of project for nature. We call them the strategic nature projects that will use what's in the paths to orient, to finance mainstreaming from other funds and to make it more coherent. So I think we have indeed some proposals out there in the co-decision process that we hope can be very valuable. I want to end up sharing just some thoughts of involving businesses, the private sector, and on natural capital. First thing, yes, public funding is very important, but we won't get there only with public funding. And actually, there are many private promoters and landowners that want to protect nature because they like it or because they can make a living also through protecting nature. So we are actually promoting through LIFE projects networks to facilitate private land conservation, and they are looking very successful. We have an innovative financial instrument, the Natural Capital Financial Facility, and it has 4 projects approved, one of which is Irish. It's an operation of 12.5 million euros investment in a fund to promote sustainable forestry in Ireland. So in essence, it promotes, instead of clear cuts, a continuous coverage forestry closer to nature with a diversification of species and using native species, significantly reducing costs of replanting, also reducing damage from extreme weather events, and still delivering for production. I think this is a nice Irish example on this. We are also observing with great interest that there is an Irish forum on natural capital working towards launching an Irish business and biodiversity network. That's very welcome. We do have a EU business and biodiversity platform because, you know, businesses, they do impact nature, but they also depend on nature. And of course, those that understand this can not only strive for longer, they can also find a competitive advantage. And we are finding more and more businesses coming forward with this understanding. My final word is just a little tale on plastics. You know, everyone that had some notions of ecology could have understood that it doesn't really make sense to do a product that we use for a couple of minutes, we throw out and it stays for centuries or millennia out there. We have been doing this for decades with plastic. Finally, the public outrage of having the oceans filled with plastic, marine biodiversity struggling with plastic was so huge, and also the notion there are alternatives, that now the condition is ripe for bold political action. For instance, replacing sustainable use plastics. Humans, unfortunately, tend to just be ready to act when they have a catastrophe in front of them. So I hope we don't need to lose the 40% of insects in a couple of decades, or to allow our farmland to be totally simplified from this intensification monoculture model that is reaching its limits when we have solutions. And I think this is pretty much, at least on land, something that can trigger change. Thank you very much.